And if I can take a dark twist here, here is the nightmare. Countries enter a kind of negative spiral where governments face this prospect of losing power because they haven't been able to deliver material comforts. And so what they do is they get oppressive, they get corrupt, not just with stealing money, but also with stealing votes. And they create an environment of such extreme resentment and social divisiveness that the worse things go, the more support they get. Because they get to say the very fact that things are getting worse is evidence that the enemy is out to get you and only we will stand up for you.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're going to chat with Gabriel Crouse about the new Employment Equity Act and race quotas being proposed by the South African government. Gabriel Crouse is a writer and analyst at the Institute of Race Relations. So Gabriel, good afternoon. It's great to have you on the show. First question, can you give our viewers some overview of the current situation of BEE so that we can compare it with this new act being proposed by the South African government?
Right. So one very interesting thing about BEE is that a leg of it has just been knocked down by the Constitutional Court. And in a sense, this was the most aggressive leading leg in this march forward for a race-based social engineering project. This specifically said that government has the right to disqualify businesses from even beginning the tender process if they don't have what the government deems to be the appropriate racial mix. These are referred to as pre-qualification criteria. And they had been in place since 2017 when Pravin Gordhan, the then finance minister, had put them in place. They were challenged at the time. They were overruled by the Supreme Court of Appeal as being unconstitutional on a variety of grounds, including a sort of a basic contradiction with Section 217 of the Constitution's requirement that if the taxpayer money rand is being spent, you better get the best bang for buck. That's what 217(1) of the Constitution says in layman's terms. The Constitutional Court shared the Supreme Court of Appeal's finding, but on different reasoning, more technical reasoning. Anyway, the point is that just last week, the Constitutional Court said, we're striking this down. You can't demand pre-qualification criteria. Everyone should be allowed to bid regardless of their race for government contracts. What the Employment Equity Act amendment bill would do is that it put those pre-qualification criteria back on the table. So that's one contrast. The second contrast, just to say, where are we with BEE today? It's that quotas are largely enforced, de facto almost entirely enforced, race quotas, by preferencing those businesses that do better in the government's idea of race quotas with government contracts. Now, that's very important because roughly a third of GDP is spent by the government. In fact, it's closer to 42%. But nevertheless, there's a whole private pool where businesses can play where they are relatively untouched by BEE qualification criteria. That's because even insofar as they have to have quotas, what they can do is set their own idea of what a reasonable quota would be and say their own path towards achieving those quotas. That's where things stand. Effectively, is that the public sector is very quota-based. The private sector is incentivized to implement quotas in order to get public sector business. But insofar as it's staying private to private up and down the supply chain, it's relatively merit-based system.
So is this what the Institute of Race Relations would call state capture 2.0?
I think that the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, EEB, it would affect state capture 2.0. I think that's directly what it's aiming to do, because what it's aiming to do is to take the rules of the SOE of the public sector universe and apply them to the private sector universe. It'll be enforceable with fines of up to 2.9 million rand or 10% of annual turnover. It'll allow the Minister of Labour to set quotas by sector and by region and by subsector at his own or her own discretion, which will basically mean the following. That in combination with the pre-qualification criteria being reintroduced, exactly those regulations that have just been struck down by the Concord, that coming back. What's the combination of those two things? It means that if there's a particular subsector in a particular region where two businesses are competing, and one of those businesses is politically connected, and they find that they don't have the same value add proposition, and therefore they're not going to get the tender, they can then consult the minister and say, for this specific sector, we would like you to set the quota such that the other business can't even apply. And the minister would then have the power to do so. And he wouldn't be breaking the rules. This wouldn't be shady corruption. This would be by the book, EEB. That's a policy environment specifically designed to achieve maximum state capture. But in case you think I'm making that up, in case you think I come from the Institute of Race Relations and we are proud non-racialists and have been for 90 years, and so we've just got to be in our bonnet about BEE. Let's look at State Capture 1.0 and the foremost analyst thereof, Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who says categorically, and you can go look this up on page 797, I've quoted this so much that I've memorized the page. He says that the primary national interest resides in getting maximum value for money in government procurement. He says that at a conclusion of several pages of analysis, and the section heading is intractable problems, where he basically says, yes, there have been some bad apples. Yes, there have been some bad actors, but the system, the legal system we are in is inevitably going to create more state capture. Why? Because it says two things that are in contrast. It says you've got to get the maximum value for money when you're spending taxpayer rands. And it says you've got to pick and choose which business you work with based on race. And he says as much as the historical imperative supports the argument for the second one, if you can't decide which one is most important, then you've got some laws which say you should go for the best bang for your buck. And then you've got other laws which say, no, never mind. And that creates legal confusion. So half the people who end up breaking the law don't even realize they're doing it because it's confusing because the law is saying two things. But the other half break it deliberately. And he details this over thousands of pages, how BEE laws are used as a fig leaf, as a Mapani worm that both conceals state capture and feeds it. This is the problem that Zondo finds to be at the heart of State Capture 1.0. And he says the solution is that quote I gave you, to say that the primary national interest is in getting value for money, is in saying, put that first, let the rest stuff go. EEB does exactly the opposite. It sets the South African economy up, the South African fiscus up, the South African taxpayer purse up for funding State Capture 2.0. And that's really something none of us can afford.
If Zondo says, and I believe it's in the final part of the Zondo Commission, that BE should be ended, will the state be forced to comply with that? Will Ramaphosa have to end BEE?
Well, look, I'd like him to do so. I should explain, and I should try to be quite precise here. Zondo's not in a position to say that BEE should be totally ended. He's in a position to say the following, and this is what he says on my reading. If you have two contracts that are alike in all respects, it costs the same, the reliability is the same, the quality of the product is the same, the service delivery time is the same, They're the same in every way in terms of cost effectiveness, transparency, competitiveness, every matrix on an ordinary economic business prospect value add project that you can think of. They're the same. Then you should choose the company that is less white. That is currently what the Constitution requires. On my reading, 217 of the Constitution basically says, first, it must be cost effective, but if you find two that are equally cost effective, you can't stop the parliament from legislating for preference for groups that are previously disadvantaged. Now, you can get into the weeds, and I think there's a way to challenge even that, because non-racialism, to my mind, says at that point you should flip a coin, because you should never be trying to help or harm people on the basis of their race. But be that as it may, the conventional way to read the Constitution says that you're limited in that point of equal value add proposition. At that point, you must engage a transformative agenda. So I don't think Zondo is saying get rid of BEE entirely. I think what he's saying is the primary national, you can't have the two interests. And he says they are inevitably going to conflict. Value add, value for money versus a racial agenda. They're going to conflict. He says you've got to figure out which one you answer first. And the first one you should answer is value for money. Then if they're alike on a cost effectiveness analysis, maybe you can engage the other thing. I think that Ramaphosa's administration should be forced to implement that advice. I think that would require no amendment to the Constitution. It would require very little amendment to legislation. In fact, it could be achieved tomorrow. And we have argued to the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, that he should achieve this tomorrow by a simple swipe of the pen, because the Public Preferential Procurement Framework Act, which is the most important bit of law other than the Constitution when it comes to this business, says that the Minister of Finance is allowed to offer exemptions for all this BEE stuff, basically, if it's in the national interest. It is in the national interest. Zondo says it's in the primary national interest. So the Minister of Finance can just write an exemption, and that would open up a kind of investment environment, in my opinion, that would benefit most South Africans, especially most poor South Africans who are unemployed and whose major obstacle is that people with the capacity to build factories, to put two bricks on top of each other in terms of paying for the bricks to start with, they are not attracted to South Africa. Whether they live in South Africa or they live abroad, they'd rather send their money elsewhere. And that means there are no factories, there are no bricks to put on top of each other. But from the bricklayers to the accountants, to the actuaries, to the whomever, there'll be more opportunities in this country if it's a more meritocratic based system of procurement and of investment. And I think that's achievable tomorrow through the simple mechanism. In the long run, and if Ramaphosa wanted it, he could just give that order. In the long run, I don't think that's going to be how it happens. And I think South Africans are going to have to stand up for the values of non-racialism that are enshrined in this Constitution. That just means we judge each other by the content of our character, not how we look. And South Africans are going to have to back that up at the ballot box at some stage, and through other mechanisms. But in the meanwhile, I consider it very important to stop things from getting worse. And EEB is worse than BEE, because it takes the quota system that's been applied to the public sector and it applies it across the board. I just don't think that makes a work environment that people want to be in. Whatever race you are, who wants to work in a job where the reason that you're there is because of how you look? It's demoralizing, it's dehumanizing, and it's very dangerous.
Yeah, it's sad to see how out of touch the South African government is with the ordinary person in South Africa. I mean, that's why they're proposing these laws. But Gabriel, what is the status, the current status of EEB? Is it currently, it has passed the National Assembly? Is it being waited to be approved in the National Council of Provinces or being signed by the president? Where is it at this moment?
That's exactly right. So it's been through, public consultation process where where good public consultation has been ignored. It's been approved by a majority in the National Assembly. It's sitting before the National Council of Provinces. As far as we can tell, no emendation is expected to come from there. So they'll just approve it. And then it sits on the president's desk. So, I'm a campaigner. That's what I do. As head of campaigns at IRR, we've been running a campaign to get people to sign up to say, stop this thing. You join our petition. We've got, I don't know how many people have signed on already, thousands, I assume. We tend to hit big numbers. Our petition is simple. We say, please, President, Mr. Ramaphosa, veto this law. And we're not really saying please. We're saying you have to veto this law because it's your duty, according to the Constitution, to veto a law if you are uncertain about whether it is constitutional or not. And you must be uncertain on the basis, for example, of the argument laid out by the Zondo Commission, on the basis, for example, laid out by the Supreme Court of Appeal, on the pre-qualification criteria being unconstitutional, on the basis that this law would apply to the private sector, whereas insofar as the Constitution envisages some of this racial preferencing thing, it specifically confines it to the public sector, to SOEs in the civil service. And specifically in the Bill of Rights lays out that you can't go preferencing in people in employment in this kind of way, generally speaking. So there are these tiers, these layers of argument, and that doesn't even begin to address the basic argument that whatever BEE was supposed to do, it has not done that. It's done the opposite. More Black people are unemployed today. More Black people are sitting at or below the poverty line today than when BEE, as a proportion of the population, than when BEE was first implemented. So it's nominal interests in helping out the poor or those that are really disadvantaged are not being successful. The interest that is being served is blatant elite enrichment, and that's of white South Africans, Black South Africans, Indian South Africans, colored South Africans that happen to be connected, that happen to be part of that patronage network, and we can show that. There are all these reasons. The last reason obviously takes a lot of evidence and data, and not everyone is ready to take the time for that. But certainly the president has got to attend to the precedents that have been set in court that show that this thing is unconstitutional. And therefore he has to veto it. And if he's in two minds, the veto requirement says he can send it to the Constitutional Court for deliberation. And we will find that bill in the Constitutional Court, and we will show that it is unconstitutional, that it is invalid, that it is going to harm the poor of this country regardless of their race, that it is going to benefit an anointed few, and that it simply cannot stand. So that is where it is in my mind. Is it's a little bit like a baseball sort of floating in the air, ready for ordinary South Africans to hit it out the park. This is not something that we can afford to let through the gate. It's gonna, if we do, it's gonna hit the most vulnerable people right in the nose. But it's really in a simple, accessible position to dismiss. And we believe we've got what it takes to do that. And of course, that's going to require some backing from ordinary citizens, but we're used to getting that backing, and we look forward to getting that backing. And the really nice thing about my job, in a way, is that I get to remind people that being a South African citizen matters. You get a right to vote, and you get a right to intervene in our legislative process in other ways too, and petitioning is one of them. And it makes a difference. We led the charge with, I think, in the end, 390,000 signatures against the constitutional amendment to achieve expropriation without compensation. And it was a grisly fight, and there was a lot of ups and downs. But in the end, the ANC couldn't even get its own members to vote for that bill. I mean, some did, but at least 20 members of parliament didn't. And that's because it becomes so obvious through the relentless efforts of civil society and of citizens who stood up that it's not actually in most people's interests to undermine property rights. In fact, it's in most people's interests, Black and white, to strengthen property rights, to make title deeds a reality for people who sit in the Bantustans, to make theft much more risky endeavor than it is today. That's strengthening property rights, and that's what's in the interest of most South Africans. Those people who sign up to those values, who make that argument, who give us the energy to deliver that to Parliament, it has an effect. We've had other victories too, and I really do think that this one, well, look, it's got to be a victory, because the alternative is that we exit the pandemic loss of 2 million jobs with a new employment regime, which is designed to increase unemployment even further. That is just not an option. Most people our age and younger don't have a job in this country, and it's just not an option to let that continue. We have to turn it around. We have to liberalize the market. We have to let people work on the basis of what they can add, and regardless of flipping how they look.
Absolutely. And we'll put a link in the description if people want to sign up to the Institute's petition and help them out. But Gabriel, is it possible with the new judges being appointed to the Constitutional Court with a new realignment? Because I know the judgment in the Pravin Gordhan case was very close. It was 5 versus 4. Is it possible with a new realignment that BEE will be able to get through, right? If 3 new judges are appointed that are more, but are on the other side, is it possible that BEE will be able to get through?
Yeah, the EEB, the worse than BEE, EEB. Can it go forward in a new Concord? I think it's possible. Look, I'm hesitant partly because I'd like us to go and make representations to the court. I don't want to say anything too rude. But as a general proposition, courts around the world do have this problem of political appointments and judges coming in who are not wedded to the law, but instead are kind of married to an ideology and just use the law as a backdrop, something that they maybe reference. But mainly they say, we know what's right. Maybe the law agrees, maybe it doesn't, but we'll make the right thing happen. That doesn't really sound like justice to me. Certainly doesn't sound like justice under the rule of law. The idea of the rule of law is that it must be predictable. So these things should be predictable regardless of the personality. I'm just expressing that we all understand that the theory doesn't always work out in practice. But insofar as that's true, it shouldn't be an invitation to give up hope. It certainly shouldn't be an invitation to sit back in complacency and take a come what may attitude. In my opinion, insofar as justices are looking outside of the law, they're looking to the public mood. And it's not completely irrational for a judge to say, you know, what do most people really think about this thing? That's not a crazy question to ask yourself. Now, we at the Institute of Race Relations can show that 80% of South Africans think jobs should be appointed by merit. We don't suck that out of our thumb. We spend a lot of money to hire the best independent pollsters in the country, people who work for businesses to figure out what their advertising strategy should be, people who are not politically committed to some ideology or another, people who just try and go and ask people, what do you think? We get them to go and ask these questions. They make sure that they do it with a rural-urban split, with a black, white, Indian, colored split that matches the demographics of the country, all that kind of stuff. Male, female, young, old. They go and ask the questions. We just report the results. And no one wants to hear it in the mainstream, if I can use that term. But the results we get year in, year out since 2013 is that 80% of South Africans want jobs to be appointed by merit. That's what South Africans want. That's what our constitution promises. It's important that idea starts getting across. And I think we're in a good position to do it. That's what we try to do. We see these moments come and go. Of course, there are moments where there's some little pocket of racial tension here or there, and people fight with each other and they shout at each other. And there's this terrible tendency to say, well, that's how the whole country is. It's like a soap opera. you're over dramatizing things. You know, the problem with the whole country is that most people are very poor and the lights don't always work. And when the rain comes, your house might flood away. You know, there are problems. They're not very exciting. You can't connect them all that much to like some grand historical narrative. It's like nuts and bolts issues. 4 million children in South Africa are orphaned or semi-orphaned. It's grisly. It's actually too grisly to really look at, which is why I think it becomes so tempting to look at this race narrative that actually plays out like a soap opera. The real narrative, the real pain that most people face is so urgent. It's so tangible. It's so concrete that this idea that race-based preferencing is the way out, it just strikes most South Africans as silly, okay, as not feasible, as not practical. We ask these questions. Would you think you would personally benefit more from BEE than from a voucher-based system for health, for education, for housing? That means the government hands you a voucher and you go find your own person to do the things and you redeem the voucher there, your own school. That way you don't have to deal with SATU, you don't have to deal with the public school, with their administration, but you're still getting some support. Would you prefer that or would you prefer BEE? 82% or something say they'd prefer vouchers to BEE. It's a little bit different amongst white respondents. Amongst white respondents, it's like 50% say vouchers, 30% say they'd like BEE. I think it's amazing.
That's interesting.
Twice as many white respondents say that they would personally benefit more from BEE than black respondents when we ask that question. And that is a consistent result. I think it should give you a sense that BEE it really is not about helping black people. It's about helping a very narrow-minded investment network, which has got a brochure of rainbow colors occupying it. You know, the Agliotis, the Zumas, the Guptas, like you've got licorice, all sorts there, but the mission is the same. It's a mission of piracy rather than a mission of value add. And I think most South Africans just see that piracy is not going to get us where we want to be. There's not enough to loot. You know, the insurrectionists can come and try, but they're not getting rich off of that. There's just not enough to loot in this country for that to be a sustainable way of living, unless it's for a tiny minority. If this country as a whole is going to go forward, it's going to have to be together, and it's going to have to be on the basis that you get paid for what you do, not for how you look. Most people really get that, and we're in a good position to show that to the court and to the court of public opinion. And if you're worried about whoever's sitting in the seat to make that judgment, obviously, if someone's totally corrupt, there's nothing you can do. But insofar as those justices are honorable justices, and I believe that they are, insofar as they can be persuaded by hard argument, and I believe that is possible, the argument, it's not enough to make that argument in court. You have to make that argument to the public because it makes a difference. It makes a difference that 80% want merit. Unfortunately, at the moment, that is like what's that phrase they use? It's like a secret. You know, it's like something everyone knows, but we don't really say it to each other.
The elephant in the room.
The elephant in the room. And if you let that elephant in the room be blindsided, then we lose. No matter how good your legal argument is, no matter how many civil societies climb in there with their multi-million rand advocates, if the elephant is unacknowledged, then I think merit loses. But if you point it out and people get around, get together and they just admit the king has no clothes, the elephant is over there, all this kind of thing, then I think the path is quite straightforward. The potential is there. It can be unlocked. Just get a stable and secure business environment where people compete on merit. South Africa is off to the races.
Absolutely. Gabriel, do you think the higher percentage of white people that support BEE, do you think that's sort of a virtue signaling?
I do think that's part of it. We see a similar result when we ask about land. So we ask a question, what do you think the two most pressing issues, the biggest problems in South Africa are that have been unresolved since 1994? And I think, look, I'm going to speak under correction here, But the answer is nationally, across all races, it's always about 2% say land. The majority say unemployment, crime, corruption, the usual suspects, things that are really big issues. 2% say land. But if you break that down by race, it's almost always a greater proportion of white respondents than black respondents that say the land is the biggest problem in this country. And I do think it's because, people who go to Wits or UCT and they learn from their professor some narrative about how all black people really want to be farmers. And then they go back to like a sheltered suburban environment where they don't really have much interaction. And then they think it's true. South Africans, you really, hit the road, get out into rural South Africa, go and talk to people that are poor and desperate, that are trying to get into the first rung of the political ladder, that would like their RDP house to just, not leak, that would like a front door that stays locked, that would like a fence in their front garden that doesn't get robbed as a prelude to their home being invaded. You speak to ordinary South Africans and the aspirations that come across are just radically different to the picture created in elite academies or parts of the Twitter sphere that are sort of run by glitterati that are, I guess, I think I'm getting the impression across, but partly I'm dodging the question because, Donald, I kind of have a problem with the term virtue signaling. Like, in a way, if you want to signal virtue, go ahead. If you want to go and donate money to charity and put it on Facebook so that people know you've donated money to an orphanage, good for you. That's fine. I don't mind when people actually are virtuous and then they signal their virtue, because in a way, I think our society does require something like that. It can be gross. It can be too much. I understand the problem with that. But to me, this thing of it's not virtue signaling, it's vice signaling. They are signaling a vice. They are signaling that to them, race matters more than character. Race matters more than the fundamental qualities that we all share as humans. Their attitude is that I call them white burden supremacists. Their attitude is that white people are superior because they carry the white man's burden. And the white man's burden is to uplift black people. And it sounds so nice given our history, but I reject it. I think as South Africans, you've got to get ahead yourself. You've got to add what value you can. You've got to love your friends and your family and do the things that you enjoy. And insofar as you want to be socially minded, and I encourage social mindedness and active citizenship, you've got to try and help people that need help. And you can't tell who needs help on the basis of their race. There are some very, very rich black people in this country and some very, very poor Indian and colored and white people. A hungry belly doesn't actually have a race. That's my opinion. And it's much better to try and fill hungry bellies than to try and uplift blackness. Because when you try and uplift blackness, you end up supporting a policy like blatant elite enrichment, which just demonstrably, just on the GDP numbers, on the employment numbers, on Stats SA's numbers, show that it's not helping the needy. It's taking rich, educated, sophisticated, connected people and making it even easier for them to get richer. And I just don't think that's fair. I don't think that's right. I don't think it has anything to do with race. I personally know a lot of white dudes who went to my private high school. I went to a very nice private high school in Sandton, one of the most expensive ones in the country. I was there on scholarship. That's fine. Was happy for the chance. Some of those rich old boys have done very nicely out of BEE deals that are white. I've seen it happen amongst my friends. It's fine. That's the system. That's the law. They're taking advantage of the law to make money. That's how humans work. Okay. Does that mean the law is right? No. We should change the law. We shouldn't hate those people. We should change the law. And we should certainly stop the law from going from BEE to EEB, where it's even worse, where it's even more incentivized to turning human beings into like some paint by number flippin' item on a color palette. It's just not what a human is. It's just not the right way to look at things.
Yeah, and I love that phrase. It's vice signaling. I hope you haven't copyrighted that because I'd love to use that. Um,
Please.
but Gabriel, so the next question is why? Why is the ANC pursuing this new Employment Equity Act right before the 2024 election, where it seems like they are bound to lose? Why would you do this?
So on the trend lines, just to back that up, you can flash the graph. If you put every municipal and national municipal election and national provincial and executive election on a graph, you will see that the ANC comes down. It's come down to what 47, 48. It'll keep climbing down. It's likely to climb so far down in 2024 that even it's combined with the EFF might not be able to manage a 50% majority. And that's because the curve is not exactly flat. It's sort of it's asymptotic. And you see the same thing with its uptick. I don't know. In a way, I've got to tell you, working at the Institute of Race Relations, we have in the past given the ANC advice, good advice in my opinion. And it is my opinion that if the ANC had continued to take our advice, they'd be doing very well. They'd have no worries about losing the next election.
There was a point where they were taking your advice?
Right. I mean, they weren't doing everything that we were suggesting, but when Trevor Manuel was finance minister, I would say half of the IRL's advice was being followed. And that's, by the way, when the ANC did the best at the polls. That's when they got 69%. So they're 20% less than that now since the 2000s. 20% fall. You know, it's a hard thing to remember, but the ANC actually did better in Mbeki's second election than they did with Mandela's first election, even though Mandela was the most beloved individual that South African politics has ever seen. By the time Mbeki was running for his re-election, the material benefits of fiscal discipline, spending less money than you earn from taxes so that you can pay down the debt rather than add to the debt, just as a starting proposition, together with others that streamlined the entry to business. This was very good. And by the way, BEE was not implemented at the time, right? It only came into force, the first tier of it, in 2007, 2008. So, man, you know, that was a time when the number of jobs in South Africa doubled, when GDP was growing at 4.5%, 5% a year, when the wealth gap between black and white was decreasing. All the good metrics that people in the ANC wanted to hit were being hit. Since then, unfortunately, the ANC has not listened to reason. It has not understood, in my opinion, that its best chance of staying in power is to give people what they want, which is material growth, and that the best way to do that is by limited government and by non-racialism. Unfortunately, I think ideology has dominated. I was very hopeful in 2017 when Ramaphosa took over. I thought that he was going to be friendly to business. Polling had suggested to me that 80% of the ANC's base preferred him to Dlamini Zuma, and 80% of the base opposed radical economic transformation. This polling was done by Mark Data, commissioned by ENCA. Very good polling in 2017 in the build-up to Nasrec. But instead of Ramaphosa opposing radical economic transformation as a policy package, which first and foremost meant expropriation without compensation, pushing NHI, pushing prescribed assets, pushing a minimum wage that's equal to the median wage, much too high. Instead of opposing that, he implemented literally all of the package, everything that had been written about in Umrabulo ANC policy documents before 2017, documents that no one else bothers to read, but I read it because it's my job. What they called radical economic transformation in the mid-20 teens, that's what Ramaphosa implemented. So once the policy guys had been arguing for it under Zuma, then Zuma goes, but the new leader comes in and he says, you know what, we're not going to change direction. We're going to do that. It's very difficult for insiders who still oppose it to get much legroom. We saw the departure of Tito Mboweni. We've seen the alienation of Motlanthe, Mbeki. We've seen the sort of, some outsider attempts to try and reform things, but basically it's not working. And I've given you the background to the answer. I'm sorry I'm circling around to it so slowly, but the simple answer is this. At the level of policy, if the ANC were to implement the policies that it needs to implement, it would include accountability. And on an estimate, the Center of Risk Analysis, which is a friend of ours, did a study into every member of the ANC's National Executive Council, 80 people or so. And they found slightly over half of them had strong prima facie evidence of corruption. They found that another 30% were in the maybe zone. And then there was another, there's definitely honest communists like Pravin Gordhan. I don't think that guy's stolen a cent in his life. He clearly would like the government to run everything and believes that SAA can never fail enough. But he's not personally corrupt, and you must respect that. Furthermore, there were a handful of ANC guys who were both personally not corrupt and sensitive to evidence of what actually works. But even putting that ideological question aside, just the basic issue of are you going to worry about the NPA breathing down your neck if you start engendering proper reforms? That already makes it seem impossible. That's the one off. And then the other half is that sort of advertising leadership, more soft touch thing that I was talking about earlier, where people really did expect Ramaphosa to come in with a change in direction in terms of policy, and that might have worked, but he didn't do that. He's stuck with the same ideology, but with a different language that he uses to convey it, in my opinion. And I'm very disappointed because I was actually a fan. And I think that when people flip-flop like that, it's actually quite demoralizing. So even if there are potential reformers left, they just see that betrayal, and then they feel, like maybe they're too long in the tooth to do anything about it anymore. And they might as well just enjoy the rest of what they have. So I think those two factors, the hard factor of who's actually going to get kicked in the teeth if accountability comes to bear, and then the soft game of power politics, has put the ANC, unfortunately, in the position where it looks at 2024, it's staring down the barrel of a gun. It sees the prospect of a coalition taking over. And like an addict, it thinks the solution to the problem is the problem. It thinks it must more aggressively pursue the policy agenda that's put it in this vulnerable position in the first place. And if I can take a dark twist here is the nightmare. Countries enter a kind of negative spiral where governments face this prospect of losing power because they haven't been able to deliver material comforts. And so what they do is they get oppressive, they get corrupt, not just with stealing money, but also with stealing votes. And they create an environment of such extreme resentment and social divisiveness that the worse things go, the more support they get. Because they get to say the very fact that things are getting worse is evidence that the enemy is out to get you, and only we will stand up for you. And we have seen this pattern in Zim. We've seen this pattern in Venezuela. We've seen this pattern, in fact, across a lot of Eastern Europe in earlier decades, which is sort of interesting because of the Crimean thing, but I won't get into that. There is a terrible pattern of resentment. It's the old French word, ressentiment, where you actually hug closer to the very thing that is pulling you down. And the I would say the South African political term for it is zonufication. And what happened in Zimbabwe is a lot like what's happening to the ANC, where the only voters that it had left were just on polling that we do are people that haven't finished school, and people that live in rural communities, and people that have a high a high index for feeling like, for being prone to demagoguery. In other words, for being persuadable on the idea that the reason they're not doing well is because some group, whether it's foreigners, whether it's 1652s as they referred to, whether it's whatever that outgroup is, that everything can be blamed that way. That's a formula for disaster. The worse the country does, the more rural, uneducated people there are, the more demagoguery kind of persuades them that just blame it on the other and hug close. Remember, Ramaphosa's line in 2014 was, unfortunately, if you vote for anyone other than the ANC, they'll bring back apartheid. He was caught saying that on a hot mic. That kind of politics in a rural area is very dangerous. It's a dark prospect. But the good news is, like I said, our polling shows that most South Africans are not there. Most South Africans are actually still 80% are still in a very common sense place. So the opportunity is ripe for us to make a change before that kind of politics can define the generations to come.
I think Ramaphosa said the Boers will come back, not apartheid will come back.
Well, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah. I'm just playing my part as the host. But yeah, that's basically the same thing. But Gabriel, it seems like Ramaphosa's basically sort of a blessing in disguise. He's not doing the right thing, but he also seems reluctant to do the wrong things, the bad things, the really bad things. So it seems like he'll inevitably lead the ANC to their inevitable defeat. He's basically the perfect person for the job we want at the moment.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea. I think that parliaments are more powerful than a lot of people give them credit for. The thing about a parliament is that it doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a personality, it's harder to relate to, and so they just don't get as much attention. And this is in every country that, Japan, US, the UK is amazing because it's got the mother of all parliaments, and so they've got a lot of pride and they pay attention to what's being said there. But even there, a lot of it comes down to personality questions about the leadership. South Africa is in a very terrible position because we don't have a lot of history of parliamentary democracy that includes most citizens, and so it's very easy to overlook. But as much as people go on about Ramaphosa, he's got the power to veto. He can stop the worst laws from being passed, and that's why we're trying to petition him. But he doesn't have the power to he doesn't really have the power to write and pass good laws that will reform things. Really, that power does, and there are bad laws that you can pass that are not unconstitutional, they're just flipping stupid. And Parliament has done plenty of that. So I think that the thing that really worries me is our parliament. The thing that really needs to change is our legislature. That does happen at a presidential election, because the presidential election and the parliamentary election happen at the same time. But I guess I'm responding by saying, I don't know whether he's the perfect guy. I actually think he's a pretty good public speaker. I think people feel very sympathetic to him. He reminds me of what some of the leadership of the Soviet Union cried out for in the 1960s. After the brutality of Stalin and de-Stalinization, they said, what we really need is socialism with a human face. Socialism is always about a gun and a jackboot and a knock on the door in the middle of the night coming to tell you how you have to live your life. Not in the sense you're not allowed to kill people, in the sense that, no, this is what you must do. That's what you must do. And it's a heavy thing. And when the first socialist regimes came to power, it was very clearly heavy. And then they said, no, this thing will only work if you've got a soft face, a human face, a gentleman. And I think he's a gentleman. I think he really is quite a softie. And I think people find that attractive. And I can see why you're saying that means he's not pushing the first too fast. He's put his weight behind it. He said he wanted EWC. He said he wants to nationalize the Reserve Bank, just not yet. He said all kinds of things. But I can see how his being soft seems to make him good or useful in a sense. But my major worry is not even really about him. It's about our parliament. It's about the laws that they write. It's about the rules of the game. the thing I keep coming back to is if you live on a pirate ship, it doesn't matter who the captain is. Because the rules of a pirate ship is that you must go find someone and steal their stuff. And your captain can be very gentle or he can be very gruff. He can talk with this accent or that accent. He can listen to nice music or rubbish music. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that if you try not to steal, then you're going to be the one thrown off the ship. That's not a good way to live. If you are on a proper ship with good rules where I don't know, you're looking for some place to plant potatoes and make a good harvest for other people to be able to eat and do trade or something like that. I don't mind if the captain is kind of boring. I don't mind if he's got a scar on his eye. I don't mind whatever. If he's got a peg leg, he can look like an actual pirate. He can have a parrot on his shoulder. He can be ridiculous. If the rules are right, I think we can live well together. If the rules are wrong, I think we're bound to clash, whoever the particular leader is. So maybe Ramaphosa is helping that set of rules in some ways and harming them in others. I think you're right to say that in some ways he's ushering in the end of that regime, that way of thinking about things, because of his lack of decisiveness and toughness. At some level, you have to be kind of tough to force the thing through. I think that is true. I think he is impressionable, and we want to take advantage of that. We want to help him. Flip and see the best chance for his legacy is actually to stop something like EEB and slow down, help South Africa slow down its demise. But with all that being said, I want to say, whether you think he's helping or hurting, in fact, whatever you think of him, he's probably not as important as most people make him out to be. What's important is the rules of the game, and those rules are set in Parliament. And that's a very important place to take the fight.
That's interesting. Gabriel, you mentioned ideologues. Are one of these ideologues Ebrahim Patel? Because it seems the more I read about him, the more it seems like he has a massive influence over the South African cabinet. I think Tony Leon mentioned in his recent book that he and Tito Mboweni clashed frequently, and that he's oftentimes overrided Tito Mboweni's decisions. And it seems like he's a member of the World Economic Forum, that shadowy organization everyone likes to talk about. So who is this guy?
That he's the minister against trade and industry or something like that. It's amazing when Ramaphosa was in full bloom. I remember having difficult conversations with people in big business whom we consult and give advice sometimes, because I had been a Ramaphosa fan, but as soon as he started making his policy recommendations, in his first Sona address the day after he was sworn in, he said we have to go through with expropriation without compensation. I was like, guys, we've got to be skeptical here. This is not good news. But I spoke to a lot of corporate, C-suite executives who said, nah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. He's on us. He's like, he understands what South Africa needs. Even those Ramaphoriacs, if you gave them half a chance, would go off about Patel. And I think it's because the closer you are to actually confronting the balance sheets of the businesses that still employ most South Africans, the more clearly you see the direct and pernicious ways in which Patel's agenda has had an effect. It really is quite it's quite frustrating. I think to his credit, he has a smooth demeanor and he's quite eloquent. And he's got a quiet confidence. I think he's also probably, quite honest in the way I was describing Praveen Gordhan. I don't know that he's personally quite as spotless, but I think he's relatively close. But he's been a difficult customer. I will say that Patel was making pretty flagrant proposals for prescribed assets, which means taking the pension pot. South Africa, by the way, has one of the largest pension pots in the world, partly because of how negative investment conditions have been. People really want to keep their money in the safest place they can keep it. And so those trillions of rands, Patel said, well, the government should just tell the asset managers to pour that into state-owned enterprises because that's like the social thing to do. Regardless of whether those state-owned enterprises are still stealing money. The immediate comeback argument is, if it's such a good idea, why aren't people doing it without a gun being forced to their head? Anyway, I remember that issue quite clearly around 2018 when Patel was making speeches, DTI and so on. And we're sort of arguing for the case for socially minded prescribed infrastructure investment through a prescription mechanism. Because I went and I wrote a piece in Business Day, and I did a couple of interviews on ENCA and SABC, where I said what Patel is pushing is basically trying to kick Gogo in the teeth and see if you can find a gold filling in there to pay for the revolution. And at the time, it seemed kind of, I don't know, some people said, nah, you're being alarmist, they're not really trying for that. But as the criticism against it heated up, the language stopped being so vague and it became more clear about exactly what was being demanded and required. And the IRR campaigns team, I wasn't involved with it directly at the time, kicked into gear pushing against it. And it was quite an interesting tussle, specifically with Patel. And the upshot of it was eventually a capitulation, where as hard as he tried, he didn't get what he wanted. And the idea of prescribed assets was put away. And really what it took was getting ordinary South Africans to switch on, to activate, to complain, and specifically to get customers of major asset managers and pension fund people who actually hold pensions, to complain to the people who are nominally supposed to be guarding their wealth and get them to send it up the chain, until a few of the CEOs eventually turned. They all started out saying, oh, no, maybe it's fine. It's probably a good idea. A little bit like with NHI. Some say it's good, some say it's bad, but it's a bit confusing. And it takes a lot of energy to activate people to complain so that the I don't want to swear, the S floats uphill instead of downhill. The irritation floats uphill instead of downhill, all the way to the CEO, and then he converts it to the minister. And then the minister's forced to back down. And that is, I claim that as a major victory for the IRR and others. There were lots of others working with us. But that was a big one for the IRR. And I've got a few on the other side of this wall. I've got a few newspaper posters framed to celebrate it, because it's an example where even a hardened ideologue like Patel can be blocked from getting his way if ordinary citizens stand up and just use common sense.
Do you think the Communist Party knows and realizes the power of that ministry? Because before him, it was Rob Davis, who I've interviewed on WorldView, that was the Minister of Trade and Industry. Do you think they know that the power of that position? That's why they always advocate that a communist takes that role.
I would I would say yes. I would say yes, they know it very well. And in a way, I feel like it's our job at the IRR to try and help South Africans realize the same thing. The ability for someone in that position to make relatively marginal changes that have knock-on effects that really end up hitting your bill at the grocery store, at the hardware store, at the scrap metal store, at the secondhand car store, wherever it may be, but also at the point of salary receipt. It's profound. It is somewhat invisible to the untrained eye, and I think that there's a nice old doctrine of the invisible cost and the very tangible concentrated reward. People like Milton Friedman like to talk about this, right? Where they said the cleverest trick that you can play as a government official is to steal an invisible amount from lots and lots of people and then concentrate it in the hands of a few people. So if you're stealing R2 off of everyone's grocery bill, they can't really see it, right? You've just changed some rule that makes it impossible. Yeah, okay, it costs R2 more to buy shampoo than it used to. You don't really notice it, but all of those R2 can be gathered up and concentrated in the hands of a few with great benefit. That's sort of traditionally the model of a developmental state that has been captured. That's the model of what a trade and industry minister is going to do if they have the power to do it and the interest in doing it. And I think that it's the basic tenet of the Communist Party that you want the government to be running everything. And that requires a great amount of resources. So how are you going to get those resources? Well, you take a little bit, concentrate it, then you've got what you need to achieve the revolution. And hey, if you don't achieve the revolution, you can sit back and sip champagne and feel good about yourself in the meanwhile. So either, you get the hardcore socialists or the champagne socialists, but either way, that model of taking a little bit from a lot of people and therefore putting a lot in the hands of a few, that ends up being a really timeless way of achieving state capture.
Absolutely. Well, Gabriel, I see our time is running out. Thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you for your time. This has been so interesting. I want to give you one last opportunity if you want to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Cool, man. I appreciate it. We live in interesting times. We've come out of the plague. We're entering a global market disturbed by a major European war. I think South Africans have a lot of reason to be apprehensive about local government conditions under coalitions, and where they're not under coalitions, under the same olds that haven't exactly been delivering services. Apprehension about how things look in 2024. Also apprehension about how things look tomorrow. It's in difficult and complicated times. It's my opinion that now and then we've got to just like lay back and kvetch and complain and just say, oh, this is terrible. But we also got to wake up the next morning and we got to do something about it. I think we can do something about it. I think this place can be amazing. I think it's had moments of glory. I think everyone actually knows that. And I welcome the opportunity to talk about what I think is the way forward. If you disagree, do something else. But if you agree, please give us some support. Donald said he'd put that link in the byline. Check it out. If I think there's something quite exciting about taking responsibility of the country that you live in, especially when it's a strange and weird one like this. I think there's actually a lot of interesting opportunities here. So I hope you take it.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, if you're going to stay in South Africa, help organizations like the Institute of Race Relations or AfriForum, or organizations that tries to fight state capture and the socialist, centralized, communist influence. But yeah, thank you, Gabriel. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, you most certainly enjoy this content. Please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.